their worst showing in Canadian history. Getting Pierre Elliott Trudeau's politically inexperienced dilettante son to run for Prime Minister was thus seen as a fairly desperate appeal to nostalgia and celebrity, and skepticism that it would work ran pretty high. I was working as a TV news pundit at the time, and I remember how popular it was for commentators on all sides to frame the young Trudeau as a bit of a airhead, a himbo even, someone who was all charms and good looks, but also deeply unqualified and unserious. Trudeau himself even leaned into this a bit, doing publicity stunts like a charity boxing match with a conservative politician that indicated he was pretty comfortable merging the worlds of entertainment and politics. But in the 2015 general election, Trudeau proved to be an effective populist of sorts, a man able to overcome elite skepticism and deliver a simple, plain-spoken message that resonated well with a broad coalition of Canadian voters. He wasn't a great orator and wasn't overly specific when it came to policy, but he preached an earnest message of the need for Canada to re-embrace its historic values of tolerance, compassion, generosity, and good global citizenship, virtues that had been supposedly lost under a decade of stern and miserly conservative rule.
What I learned from my father is that to lead this country, you need to love this country. Love it more than you crave power.
This reflected one of Trudeau's greatest skills as a politician, an ability to elicit trust by appealing to a sense of hope. It wasn't for nothing that people likened him to Barack Obama. When he was decisively elected Prime Minister on October 19th, 2015, he used a line that became an immediate catchphrase of his and a succinct summary of what he hoped to offer, as well as a standard against which his time in office would be judged.
Sunny ways, my friends, sunny ways.
Trudeau would be elected twice more for a total of 9 years in office. And in reflecting on the legacy of those 9 years, I want to talk about 3 specific realms in which I believe his mark was most notably felt: social issues, the Canadian economy, and Canada's role in the world. But before we get to any of that, let us hear a quick word from today's video sponsor, Ground News. Hello, friends. So this looks to be a very busy year in the world of politics. Canada is getting a new prime minister or two. There's going to be a big national election, and I assume things are happening in other places as well. So it's never been more important to have a robust strategy to stay informed. And one way that I do that is by using Ground News. Ground News is more than just a news aggregator that consolidates and summarizes the most important headlines from over 50,000 different media outlets. It is also a public service that helps you keep track of critical information about these news providers, like their ideological biases and ownership structures. When you load up Ground News on your mobile device or desktop or browser extension or phone widget, you can easily see at a glance how different stories are being given different amounts of attention or being spun in different ways by different sorts of sources. For example, the fact that one of Trump's top diplomats recently characterized Russia as having been provoked into war with Ukraine was a story mostly reported by the center-left press, while news of a new book alleging a White House cover-up of President Biden's cognitive decline was reported mostly by conservatives. Stories like these are easy to find with Ground News' famous blind spot feature. Anyway, fans of my channel can get an amazing 40% off when they sign up for a Ground News Vantage plan. That's the equivalent of just $5 a month. So give a click to the link in the thing below or give this QR code a scan. So don't delay, give Ground News a try today. Ground News, a better way to stay informed. So looking back, Trudeau really strikes me as a leader who was shaped by his times as much as he shaped them himself. A classic example would be this idea of Trudeau being very woke, which is a stereotype that I imagine will play a large role in the way he's remembered. Trudeau seems like a very naturally and even anxiously empathetic person in the way that men of privilege can sometimes be. But he also happened to come to power during an era that some wags have dubbed the Great Awakening. This refers to the idea that American culture became sharply more politically correct sometime around the mid-2010s, lasting until like now-ish. It was a time in which a lot of people became much more hyper-vigilant against acts of racism and sexism, while activist movements like Me Too and Black Lives Matter emphasize the degree in which racism and sexism remain prominent and even systemic parts of our culture. As Prime Minister, Trudeau went out of his way to signal allyship to these movements, often using his talents for the more performative side of politics to make grand gestures of empathy. He was the first Canadian Prime Minister to march in a pride parade. He initiated name changes of government buildings associated with problematic historical figures, and he issued a number of symbolic apologies and pardons for some of the oppressive acts in Canada's past. And yet, in 2019, Trudeau narrowly avoided cancellation himself when it was revealed that he had repeatedly worn blackface at parties as a younger man. It was an extraordinarily humiliating moment that his critics seized upon as a case study in how a lot of righteous social justice warriors often had skeletons of hypocrisy in their own closets. This was only compounded by the fact that Trudeau also had a number of high-profile ethics scandals throughout his tenure, which similarly fed into this idea that being a good person required more than just gestures. Now, Trudeau reserved his greatest social justice passions for redressing the plight of the Native Canadians, a tragic situation that has long been singled out as the most truly systemic form of racialized oppression in Canadian society. In some significant ways, Canada has long lagged behind places like the US and Australia in terms of forging a workable modern system of recognizing the sovereignty and self-governance rights of the country's Indigenous peoples. You could easily argue it wasn't really until the 1990s that this started to be treated as a priority of the Canadian government, and even then only in a pretty vague sense. Trudeau's government, however, very consciously made Indigenous rights a huge focus of his tenure, prioritizing two principles in particular: reconciliation, or the notion that Canada must honestly own up to its past mistreatment of the Native Canadians, and nation-to-nation relationships, or the idea that Canada's government must conduct itself in a way that recognizes and dignifies the First Nations of Canada as independent, sovereign entities with rights and powers equal to that of the Canadian state. Shortly after Trudeau was sworn in, something known as the Truth and Reconciliation Commission released a big report. This was a commission that had been set up during the previous administration as part of a class action lawsuit with Native Canadians who had been abused in various ways by government-run Indian boarding schools, but its mandate had since spiraled into a much more ambitious project seeking to document everything wrong with Canadian Indian policy. The report made 94 very sweeping recommendations, and Prime Minister Trudeau promised to implement all of them.
It is to accept fully our responsibilities and our failings as a government and as a country.
And in seeking to do this, Trudeau's government presided over a rather dramatic evolution of Canadian culture in a way that has made the plight of the Indigenous peoples of this country front and center in the public consciousness like never before. It manifests in everything from so-called land acknowledgements at the start of virtually all government meetings and announcements.
Hi everyone, glad to be here with you in Ottawa on the traditional territory of the Algonquin people.
That we are on the traditional lands of the Haudenosaunee, the Wendat, Anishinaabe, and the territories of the Mississaugas of New Credit.
The RSMP would like to respectfully acknowledge that our gathering and work today is happening on the traditional territories of the Wimouth-Quiyum people.
To schools changing their curriculum to mandate all sorts of new Indigenous history and culture classes, to a new national holiday to recognize the legacy of the abusive residential schools. Trudeau, of course, wasn't directly responsible for everything that's been done in Canadian society in the name of honoring the 94 recommendations. But as head of the country, he definitely chose to invest a lot of his political capital into giving the report's recommendations a revered status in Canadian society. And the consequences of his choosing to do this have in some ways changed the day-to-day character of Canada the most. Beyond the rise of a lot of new symbolic gestures of atonement and commemoration, the nation-to-nation idea has also changed the way a lot of public policy is made in Canada. The notion that Indigenous governments must be consulted before their treaty lands, or in some cases lands they simply hold traditional claim to, can be used by outsiders, became much more enshrined in Canadian law under Trudeau, as well as enforced by a number of consequential court rulings by judges that Trudeau appointed. This